Welcome, everybody, to the Rise and Fall Fantasy Football Show, Week 4 edition. I'm your host, Dave Sarner. I'm going to be talking to you about every single matchup and every single fantasy asset that you need to know about for your Week 4 matchups here this week. And this week is a special week for me. I am riding solo for the first time today. No co-host today. It will be a solo show where we are going to go over every Week 4 matchup. We added a couple more statistics to the game-by-game analysis this week. We wanted to make sure that we got your quarterback rankings, your running back rankings, your tight end rankings, and your wide receiver rankings. Go through the analysis and get you your picks for this week's matchups. In this episode, we cover 4 games from the 1 o'clock docket once again. The Ravens at my Washington football team, the Vikings at the Texans, the Seahawks at the Dolphins, and the Steelers at the Titans. Obviously, for the 2 games in this episode, they might be postponed. The Steelers, Titans, Texans, Vikings, both of those games are in danger of being postponed and potentially moved. We already know the Steelers and Titans is postponed. It should be until Tuesday or Monday is what they're reporting. So we're hoping that maybe it could be a doubleheader. They move the Monday night game, and maybe the Vikings and Texans, unless they test negative and they're good to go, maybe they get moved there as well. And we still have all those games for Week 4. Now, other news for these matchups, Chase Young, the number 2 overall pick for the Washington football team, who's had a really strong start to his year. He is officially out for the next week, maybe 2 weeks. They also lost defensive lineman Matt Ioannidis for the entire year with a torn bicep. He is on IR. And then outside of that, the Seahawks and the Dolphins, there was no relative injuries. You guys are good on those matchups. So without further ado, here is episode 2. We have a matchup that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the Baltimore Ravens visiting the Washington football team. Now, this is going to be a tough matchup, Washington fans. We all know it. The second we saw how the game ended on Monday, we said to ourselves, hey, Ravens are going to come in angry, man, and they're going to come in angry. Lamar Jackson, I expect to go off this week. I think Kyler Murray kind of shredded this Washington team from a quarterback running perspective in Week 2. I expect Lamar Jackson to have similar results in the run game. Maybe, 83 yards and a touch. I do expect him to get at least 1 rushing score. And I think we might see someone like a Mark Andrews go off if he's available. I don't know what's going on with the injury. Nick Boyle could be a sneaky play if Mark Andrews is out. Marquise Brown obviously could be a decent play. Safeties aren't exactly the greatest for Washington, but I don't really like the running backs here, and we'll show you why in a second. On the other side of things, Dwayne Haskins here didn't really produce last week. He struggled hard. This was his first game. I truly felt like he really struggled. 3 interceptions. I think he had another fumble loss, so 4 turnovers. Antonio Gibson would have had 13 points, or I think 13-7, if he didn't have this weird fumble right at the halftime. So it was not even like a legit fumble for him. So Gibson's floor is pretty good, though. I think 8-9 points minimum. If you're comfortable running with like that 0 running back kind of strategy, throw him in your lineup. I think he's going to be solid. Not in this matchup. This is a tough matchup for him. But if you have to start him, I do think he'll at least get you 6, 7, 8 fantasy points. So if you think you could find someone that could produce more than that, then go for them. But if not, then roll with Gibson. See what happens. Worst case, he gets a touchdown and he gives you another 11 points. Terry McLaurin, I know the matchup is a little tough overall, but I do like Terry again this week. They're targeting him. 8 targets. He's clearly the guy who is outside of maybe Logan Thomas, but he's clearly the guy in Washington. So explosive, so good. He would be easily a wide receiver 2, potentially even a wide receiver 1 already on fantasy teams if he was on one of those high explosive offenses anywhere in the league or had someone who can really get on the rock a lot. I tell you right now, if he was in Arizona with Kyler Murray, Terry McLaurin would be all pro. It's just the facts. Logan Thomas could be an interesting play here. Washington's defense, I'm phasing out. You're not going to start him against this matchup. Baltimore's defense, you can, but just be mindful. And what I mean by that is when you look at the rankings here, let's go with Washington first. The Ravens are giving up the 8th most points against quarterbacks, even though that's a good matchup for Dwayne Haskins. That's very skewed right now because of Patrick Mahomes. So just be mindful that that's not really the true stat for the Ravens. You're not going to go out and start Dwayne Haskins. Running back, this is where I say if you cannot start Antonio Gibson, leave him on your bench this week. 29th against the run. Ravens have always been stingy against the run, and it continues this year. I'm not going to go with Antonio Gibson this week unless I need to. In my podcast league, I have him as a RB2, and I might need to start him this week. So, you don't want to go out of your way to do it, but listen, it is what it is. I don't expect 11 points. I expect more of a lower floor, 6, maybe 7 points for Antonio Gibson. If he gets a touchdown, then great. That blows that projection out of the water, and you'll be thrilled if you did start him with that mentality, right? Wide receiver, 16th against most points given. Listen, it's not the best, but it's not the worst either. Middle of the pack. I think Terry can at least get you 11, 12 points this week. At least kind of produce what he did last week, 6 for 80. Maybe a touchdown this game or so forth. We don't know how the game script exactly is going to go, but we'll see down the road. Tight end, Logan Thomas could be an interesting sleeper in this game. Fifth most points the Ravens are giving up against tight ends. Logan Thomas has gotten 7 targets minimum in the first 3 weeks. He hasn't produced overly a lot, but this could be the week where that happens. Personally, though, I did drop him for a different tight end in my league. I just don't need him. I have Tyler Higbee and a couple other guys, so wasn't exactly a need for me at that moment. But if you were holding on to him and you need a TE to stream this week, Washington TE, Logan Thomas could be interesting option for you. Now, on the other side of things, you're going to start the Lamar Jackson, 14th against quarterbacks. Now, Grant, so you look at these Washington stats and you say to yourself, well, they got 2 points in week whatever and 5 points the week before. They had 17 points, but against the Eagles, and Eagles had 90 fucking people missing. I get that. All right, I do. But this defense also is at the mercy of Dwayne Haskins and his turnovers. Last week, the reason why, scoring-wise, it was so good is because, or the defense let up a lot of points and they didn't get as many points, is because of the turnovers and the field position. I don't know if that's going to happen every week. I am hoping that Dwayne can clean that up. And I'm going to go under the assumption that Dwayne will at least clean that up because he did keep the ball safe week 1 and 2. And I think that maybe he'll try to do it here. I'm sure this Ravens defense is going to cause a turnover or two. But we'll see what happens. I think the game script could be in favor of turnovers for the Ravens, obviously. And that could hurt everything else. And that all being said, we're starting Lamar Jackson. Again, I was a little on the running backs for the Ravens. If you want to start Mark Ingram, go for it. But just be mindful, we don't know how they're going to split up those carries. That concerns me. And the Washington defense is not that bad against the run. 19th is a little deceiving. They shut down the run game week 1. No Miles Sanders there, though. Week 2, they shut down Kenyon Drake. They shut down Chase Edmonds. However, that 19th ranked is for the quarterback, Kyler Murray, putting up 96 yards and I think 2 touchdowns, but 1 or 2 touchdowns, whatever that was. That's great news, though, for the Ravens. Lamar Jackson should really benefit from this. 14th and 19th, he'll have a good game. But again, it's a deceiving stat because the Washington team has played really well against running backs. Even last week, Nick Chubb played really well, but again, field position allowed him to have an easy, good game, and it was tough when you're starting your drives on the 40 or the 30 in your own zone. If you look at those stats, though, compared to what Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb were doing weeks 1 and 2, they actually were a little down last week overall. Because the two of them together is where I kind of evaluate that running back field, right? Because of fantasy production. So I don't really necessarily love the running backs this week. I don't know who's going to be the guy. Maybe one of them scores, no doubt. So if you have to roll with like a Mark Ingram, go for it. But just be mindful. It could be J.K. Dobbins this week. Heck, it can even be Gus Edwards. Hell, it could even be Patrick Ricard this week that gets in the end zone or gets some of the yards. Wide receiver, I don't like Marquise Brown, and I said it before because their secondary, Washington's secondary is sneaky good. All right, they for the most part held DeAndre Hopkins in check last week. They did some decent. They held the receivers in check last week as well, even despite a bad game. They didn't have to throw the ball last week, but they still held them in check a little bit, and they held the receivers in check against week 1 against the Eagles. So we'll see what happens here in week 4 here against the Ravens. I am not as thrilled about the pass game. However, like I said, if Mark Andrews goes, you start him. This is the 20-point week that I projected last week. He will have it this week. And if he doesn't, Nick Boyle will get in the end zone this week. He won't have the same production as Mark Andrews, but he will at least get in the end zone and get you 9 to 10 fantasy points minimum this week in a half-point PPR. So those are my guys. The 2 tight ends, Logan Thomas, Nick Boyle, or Mark Andrews. I like those matchups, obviously. Even though the matchup's good for Dwayne Haskins, you're not starting him against the Baltimore Ravens defense. Ravens, you're going to start them this week. The defense against this Washington team, after what Cleveland was able to do in the turnovers, you got to see if you can rattle that young quarterback and see if he's still in his own head from his turnovers last week. We're going to really see the mentality growth of Dwayne Haskins this week, and that's going to really determine if he's the future or not. I think this is actually a perfect matchup for him to, listen, I don't expect Washington to win, but let's see if they come in and be competitive. And if they could do that, that's from a fan standpoint, I'll be happy. And hopefully from a fantasy perspective with Terry and Gibson, at least I'll be happy there this week. So just to recap before we move on here, 53 seconds left. Perfect. We love Lamar Jackson this week. We're not as big on the running backs or the wide receivers for the Ravens. Deceivingly good matchup on the Washington side for that. You're going to start the tight end, whoever is the starting tight end, Mark Andrews. If not, go and get Nick Boyle. He should be involved. Baltimore loves using multiple tight ends in sets usually, either way. But if Mark Andrews is out, he loves his tight ends. He will get Nick Boyle the ball. Ravens defense, you're going to start them this week. On the other side of things, feel good to fire up Terry McLaurin is the only guy. My sleeper in this game is Logan Thomas, and I am sitting Antonio Gibson this week. I don't like this matchup, even though I still think he might end up getting another touchdown and similar production as last week. Oh, and by the way, we're not starting the Washington defense. We're not starting Dontrell Inman. We're not starting Miles Boykin. And we're not starting Willie Snead. Okay? And so with that matchup done, we get into our next matchup here. The Minnesota Vikings head into Houston to play a really, really bad Houston Texans team. And who could have seen this after 3 weeks with the Houston Texans? Certainly not me. You know, I can never think that, trading away your star wide receiver so you can pay your quarterback who needs that star wide receiver to be truly productive. For a running back who's 28 years old and has been off injured and not that great. Good trade, Bill O'Brien. I mean, guys, it's so noticeable how the Texans are just not as explosive and not as much of a threat as they were with DeAndre Hopkins. It's that noticeable. Now, yeah, sure, Randall Cobb had a good game. Will Fuller had a good game. But like Matt and I discussed last week, the Texans kind of have like 3 number 3 receivers, if you will. 3 number 2 receivers, if you will. No one that is like they're all good. They were all number 1 receivers to a degree, or number 2 receivers like 4 or 5 years ago. Okay. Now it's like you have Will Fuller and Cobb who are good, but they're not amazing. They're off, Will Fuller, he's bound to get hurt eventually. Cook's not impressed with him at all. Kenny Still's not impressed. David Johnson not impressed. So with all that being said, it is a tough matchup here with David Johnson here. This is an interesting matchup. Now, some of the stats might say you start some of these guys against Minnesota, but listen, if Minnesota found their number 2, it could be a problem for Houston this week. I don't think they're equipped right now for shootouts. Now, granted, they played pretty well against the Steelers last week. I mean, Deshaun had 17 points. David Johnson got in the end zone. You had Will Fuller and Cobb step up finally. I don't expect the tight ends to do much. So they were productive. But I do think that they're going to struggle again this week. I'm a little worried about playing David Johnson in my one league. But again, I'm not going to start Antonio Gibson, who's my other running back, who I would start over him in that league. Before we get into anything, let's look at the stats and we'll revert back. But so we talk about the Texans. Vikings are 22nd against the quarterback position. That's not good news for Deshaun Watson. That's a fall for Deshaun Watson. And I had him on my faller list last week, very lowly ranked, and 17 points was pretty accurate for where we had him. He was not in the top 20 for me, and he was a guy who I was trying to avoid last week. And guess what, guys? I'm going to try to do it again this week. I don't think he has a good matchup. You can say, all right, well, yeah, they have some opportunities, absolutely, but I think it's going to be more of a David Johnson show. And some people are a little down on David Johnson this week. I actually really like this matchup. I think the Vikings, if they can make some things happen from a passing game, it could be a somewhat of a shootout. And I'm not saying that's gonna bump David Johnson's value, because it could very well bump it down. But I think that if he gets more receptions from that perspective, it could be a good game for him. Just don't, David Johnson is what he is. I don't think he's going to be amazing, but he's going to get you volume. They're going to give him the touches. So if you have him, you most likely have him as your RB2. Hopefully not your RB1 like I do in my one league. So you should feel a little more comfortable playing him if you have to. At the same time here, I like guys like James Robinson over him. Maybe not Antonio Gibson. But there are a lot of players who I would probably take over David Johnson. However, the matchup is good. I do think it's a little deceiving, though, with 8th most fantasy points in the Vikings. They are going to be a little better than they've been the last few weeks. And I think the week 2 game was a little skewed for the Vikings of how bad they played. So be mindful of that. On the wide receiver end, listen, they do give up points to the wide receiver position. I mean, Will Fuller, flex wide receiver 3. I think if he's healthy, you can feel comfortable with him. Cobb is a little hit or miss. I mean, he had the bigger game last week, but he can very well have a down game this week. I'm going to say that I'm a little more confident in Will Fuller healthy than I am with Randall Cobb. I know it's an obvious one. He's number 1 in a way, but I think if you can try to avoid Randall Cobb, the matchup is deceiving. If you need him, go for it. But I think there's other options that you can do. I would personally, if you have like Terry and you think you're like, well, Randall Cobb, don't do that. Start Terry, even in tough matchup. He's going to get your volume, and he's going to at least get the ball and with a chance to score. I mean, hit or miss. I mean, his minimum floor is pretty high, so I would roll with something like that. I'm not a huge fan of Fuller, though it is a good matchup. So, hey, listen, if you want to fire up Will Fuller and even follow up Randall Cobb if you need to, I'm not going to sit here and tell you you're an idiot because, the matchup is good. On the other side of things, Dalvin Cook, you're starting all day. He's going to be one of my top guys on my risers. Yeah, and at the end of the day, 4th in points for. He had a big game last week, 24 points, 181 yards, a touchdown last week. That will continue this week, in my opinion. I think he's going to get it going, and I think that will open up the pass for Adam Thielen, who's going to have a really strong week. Justin Jefferson, I don't think he's going to put up the points that he did last week. I might go for him, though. 19th against the pass. I think that the Vikings can step it up just a little bit this week and get going here on offense like they did last week with the 2 of them involved. So we'll see. I'm not going to go out of my way and say, hey, listen, start Justin Jefferson right away. Maybe put him on your bench if you can afford it. See what he does for another week. And then if he goes off again and it's clear that he's getting 7+ targets and he's getting, a good volume amount, then okay, you could throw him in your lineup the next week. But Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook are my 2 go-tos. I'm not starting Kirk Cousins this week. Even in a decent matchup against Houston, I do think that they're going to play him pretty well. So that does temper my excitement a little bit on the wide receivers. That's why I have Thielen ranked a little highly. Jefferson I like, but I have him ranked a little bit lower. And then tight ends, I mean, listen, if you're not going to start any of them, but maybe Kyle Rudolph, Irv Smith does something to maybe increase the weapons. Who knows? I'm not going to really go out of my way to start them, though. And then on the Texans side, you're not starting tight ends. You can go Will Fuller. It's a great matchup this week. Just be mindful that, listen, the Vikings, if they're more high-powered this week than they have been, like they kind of were last week, it could be a tough matchup if Texans can't get the ball downfield, which is where they've struggled the most. If that turns into the case, I can see it being a rough day all around, not just for David Johnson, but for the receivers, for Deshaun Watson. Listen, maybe I'm just down on the Texans, but I'm personally going to try to go out of my way to not start them. David Johnson, maybe Will Fuller. I would say the most comfortable in Houston that you have is David Johnson. Game script can change that very quickly, so be worried about that. But David Johnson, in my opinion, the best matchup for the Texans against the Vikings this week. Dalvin Cook, obviously, for the other side of things. And even though Texans are a little stingy, I do expect the Vikings to make this a good ball game, to get some good air yards. But I think this game is going to run through Dalvin Cook. And I think it might be just a little tick down even for Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen this week. Moving right along here, we have the next matchup. And this is a really interesting matchup in my opinion. It has a very dynamic offense and a really stingy defense, actually, surprisingly, in the Miami Dolphins. The Seattle Seahawks visit Miami Dolphins in Miami. Now, guys, I don't have to tell you at this point, if you have Seattle players in terms of DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, or Russell Wilson, they're in your lineups, they're starting, you're not looking anywhere else, you're not getting fancy, you're not trying to figure out, well, who can I stream as a streamer this week as a flyer? No, none of that bullshit. You start these guys, they are top tier talent right now. They are wide receiver ones on some fantasy teams, the way they're producing on any week basis. Russell Wilson is a stud, number one quarterback right now in fantasy. The Seattle team, by the way, the number one scoring team in fantasy overall, 370 points they're scoring, averaging about 120 something points a game. So this 145 is normal. And you can see Dolphins 80 after their good game against Jaguars, they only put up 80 points. You're talking about a 65 point swing that Seattle is producing from a fantasy perspective as a team each week over their opponent, or over this opponent rather. With that being said, expect a high tempo game. Russell Wilson, again, you're starting. DK, you're starting. Tyler, you're starting. Now, Chris Carson can't go, okay? He is going to be replaced by Carlos Hyde. People picked him up in the waiver wire this weekend. He'll be a guy that, yes, I will have up there. The matchup is pretty stingy, but Carlos Hyde could be a really interesting option. He's been productive. He had a really good year for Houston last year. So if he has to start and you have him and you need a running back too, or even a flex, he could be a good play for you guys. DK Metcalf, your obvious start. Tyler Lockett, obvious start. Russell Wilson, obvious start. On the other side of things, listen, as long as Fitzpatrick is running hot right now, you start him. 24 points last week. Didn't have to do crazy amounts. The defense really stepped up. I like Ryan Fitzpatrick this week. Before I go into the rest of the matchup, I just want to double check here. So let's see Seattle. Seattle is second against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points produced. That's a great stat from Ryan Fitzpatrick this week. And then the other one I wanted to talk about is number one against wide receivers. Devontae Parker and Preston Williams, I am not the biggest advocates for them. I'll admit that. Haven't been in the past, haven't been a huge fan. I have Preston Williams on two teams, hasn't really produced. This is the week, ladies and gentlemen. Devontae Parker is going to have a solid game. He's going to have an explosive game. Preston Williams is going to get in the end zone. He's going to have double-digit fantasy points. Mike Gesicki is going to have a stud game. He's one of my top tight ends in this week's matchup, or in this week's matchups overall. I love those guys this week. I think they do pick it up. Now, granted, I'm sure this will end up being the game where Fitzpatrick throws 5 interceptions and Tua comes in later in the game, and so the production probably won't be what it is. Listen, I'm not going to worry about that right now. Fitzpatrick right now is hot. He might have 1 or 2 weeks left of this, or it might be this week. But right now, you ride him while it's hot. Fitzpatrick's a great DFS option, great streamer option. If you need him for 1 more week, play him. Devontae Parker, meanwhile, Preston Williams, I do like them this week. I think they both have double-digit fantasy points against a really, really bad defense that got worse with some injuries. Gesicki also is my star of the week, if you will. I think that for the Miami Dolphins, I should say, I think that he's the guy who's going to have a really, really, really good game. And then on the other side of things, obviously, you're going to start the 2 guys, Russell Wilson. You could start Carlos Hyde. Now, granted, I just want to be mindful here. We're phasing out tight ends. I don't like Greg Olsen. 25th Dolphins are against the tight end position. That middle of the defense, those linebackers from Miami are really good. Kyle Van Noy and company, they're smart. Don't go with Greg Olsen and them. He might get you a touchdown, but he's going to have like 6-7 fantasy points. Not worth it. You're obviously going to start Russell Wilson 4th against quarterbacks here. Running back 16th. Not a terrible matchup for Carlos Hyde, but not the best either. Again, I think there's some other options you might be able to go with. Game script could be more passing than it is running in this matchup, so I don't know how Carlos Hyde is going to operate in that role, getting passes out of the backfield consistently. 13th against wide receivers, you're starting Lockett, you're starting Metcalf. There's really no argument there. And then again, I know Mike Gesicki is going up against a really tough matchup, but he is my sleeper to go off this week. I really do believe that they're going to get him involved. The Seahawks, if you think about their matchups, haven't exactly played the most amazing tight ends in the world. They're going up against Dolphins. Gesicki's looked really good this year. I expect him to go off a little bit more this week against Seattle. He is my sleeper of the week. And then, of course, you have your locked in at quarterbacks. I love Fitzpatrick. I like Devontae Parker. I do like Preston Williams. I think this is the week that he goes off. I don't like the running backs in this matchup. And I don't like the tight ends outside of Mike Gesicki, even in a tough matchup. And moving right along now, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers against the Tennessee Titans. Now, luckily for us, I originally heard that this game looks like Tennessee had a couple players that were tested positive for COVID. They tested both teams and everything like that. All the reports here as of Wednesday morning sounds like this game is going to happen. So just be mindful of that. If you're going to, have any of these guys in your matchups, you just want to make sure that you're good to go, that you have the right guys. Now, I have Deontay Johnson. We'll see what happens with him in the injuries. I don't know how that's going to work right now. At the same time, I just also don't know who's going to step up. I had James Washington and Chase Claypool as targets last night in case Deontay Johnson couldn't go. Here's the thing. Expect if Deontay Johnson can't go, sure, James Washington's going to be the guy. But don't be surprised if Chase Claypool will come out of nowhere and be that second highest producing receiver, or Eric Ebron. If Deontay Johnson can't go, keep an eye out for Eric Ebron, 27% owned. Before the waiver wires last night, it probably went up a little bit. People might overreact for that, but James Washington might be there. He would be the first option if Deontay is out. Again, we'll know later in the week what's the better overall matchup for him this week. Now, getting into the matchups here, I do like Ben Roethlisberger this week to a degree. James Conner, 22 points last week, 109 yards and a touchdown, 5 targets for 4 receptions, 40 yards. Listen, I'm a hater of James Conner. I admit that from week 1 to now. But I've also said this entire time, you ride him while he's hot. Ride him while he's hot. Ride him while he's healthy is the more important thing. Because at the end of the day, once he goes down, it's going to be the Benny Snell show, most likely, in Pittsburgh, if that happens. Hopefully he stays healthy, and hopefully he rewards you this year. I'm just not taking that risk. But again, you do start him this week if he goes. I'm still waiting to hear if Adoree Jackson and A.J. Brown are both going this week. That could change the dynamic of this matchup just a little bit. I think you would downgrade Juju just a tad if Adoree Jackson's back. And then you would maybe have James Washington or Claypool up if Deontay can't go. If Deontay can go, he would be a guy who I would actually have projected a little higher. So I do like the Steelers overall. Obviously, Derrick Henry, it's a tough matchup, guys. Really tough matchup, but you're not going to not start Derrick Henry. I don't expect him to put up 26 fantasy points this week. Tannehill could struggle a little bit again, especially with no A.J. Brown. Jonnu Smith, let me just talk about him for a second. 8.6 points, 5 for 61. That's pretty much what you should expect for Jonnu Smith on a weekly basis. I think as a floor guy, he's going to give you something around there every week, and he might have those weeks where he goes off. I just don't think this week's that week. I think he's going to produce more like he did last week. 8.6 points, maybe a little less. I'm not as high on him this week, but at the same time, listen, you never know he's going to get in the end zone, right? So I think for him, his value this week might be a little more touchdown dependent, as well as Derrick Henry's. And so I downgrade the Titans just a tad because of that aspect, that it could be a very touchdown dependent game, and that could be a rough area for them. Now, going into the stats here, and this kind of mirrors what we just talked about. The Titans going up against the Steelers, well, they're stingy against the quarterback. I don't like Tannehill. Again, Derrick Henry going up against the 31st best running back defense in the league. They're going up against the 8th worst wide receiver defense in the league. So, of course, if A.J. Brown was going, I would like A.J. Brown in this matchup. I really would. But maybe Adam Humphries is a deep sleeper here. I don't expect Corey Davis to really quite go off. And I expect one of those guys to deliver. But again, Jonnu Smith, 21st against the tight ends. So they're really stingy against all the positions of strength for the Tennessee Titans. And that scares me if you're a Tennessee Titan owner of any of those players. Outside of maybe A.J. Brown, if he's healthy and ready to go. He would be a guy I would fire up. Corey Davis has a great matchup, but I'll be honest with you guys. I don't think he's as good as, he is, as some people might think he is. I don't even know if people think he's actually that good. But I don't expect Corey Davis to do crazy things against Minkah Fitzpatrick and Joe Hayden in this defense. If he's the number one, man, for me personally, I'm probably going to try to phase out what I can. If I have a better option over Jonnu Smith, I will. Derrick Henry, you're going to start regardless, but just be mindful it's going to be a down week for him. On the other side of things, the Titans are a little bit more, allowing of stats and points on the board and touchdowns and so forth. They are 19th against quarterbacks. So, Big Ben, not a great matchup, but not a terrible matchup. The running back position, like I said, James Conner, you fire him up. He's going to be RB1 for you as long as he stays healthy. And watch, I bet you he gets hurt. I bet you. But if he stays healthy, get 9th against running backs in terms of total points allowed. That's great. Go for it. Tight end, Eric Ebron, like we said, could be a really good option this week. The Titans are 7th against the tight end position. And wide receiver at 14, still pretty solid, even if it's middle of the pack. Feel good about maybe Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson. That is if Adoree Jackson is still out. Double check that before you do anything outside of Juju, okay? Even with Juju, it could be a pretty tough matchup on his end. However, the matchup overall, you're going to start Juju most likely. So for James Washington, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, really, double check to see if Adoree Jackson's going, because that could actually open up some things for the depth chart guys rather than Juju if he's being shadowed by Adoree. Okay, so just be mindful of that. And try to see if they have a plan on shadowing Juju. That could open up the door for Deontay. And if he can't go, I really like potentially Chase Claypool, not James Washington, to have the big score. He would have had a score this week. And Chase Claypool, let's see, what did he do this week? He had 4 targets, 1 for 24, and he extended for the end zone, and he missed it by that much. So at the end of the day, he would have had you 8.9 fantasy points as a wide receiver 4, and he would have outproduced James Washington even on more targets. He has explosion, and I really like him. If Deontay's out and Adoree Jackson is in, 2 keys that have to be there, I do like Chase Claypool as a sleeper over James Washington. That is a really deep, bold prediction right now. Very deep. So just be mindful that, hey, 2 things have to happen for that prediction to actually be true. On the other side of things, we're phasing out Ryan Tannehill. Again, very tough against the quarterback, very tough against the running back. Derrick Henry, you're going to start, but don't feel excited about it. Wide receiver, A.J. Brown, I would start in this matchup if he's healthy. Corey Davis, people are going to start, but honestly, if I have something better, I'm going with that. I don't trust Corey Davis. Even last week when he was the main guy, 6 targets here. Humphreys out-targeted him. And Khalif Redmond is the one who outproduced him, So I'm not a Corey Davis fan this week at all. I think if you have A.J. Brown, you start him. You can throw him in as your flex. That's kind of it. Outside of Derrick Henry, you're going to start. Outside of all that, you don't start anyone else in Tennessee this week. And that's including Jonnu Smith. He might get you a good floor, but they're pretty stingy against tight end. I just don't expect big things from him this week. On the Steelers side, of course, James Conner, you start him. Big Ben, again, 19th against the pass. You could start him, and this matchup could be good. Their defense could help him have a better day if they get turnovers. So you're starting Pittsburgh's defense. And Big Ben's a good start here this week. Could be cheaper on DFS to a degree. James Conner, you start while he's healthy. Juju, you're going to start if you have him. Just be mindful. Watch out. Double check for Adoree Jackson. Week 3 waiver or IR is over, so he can return from now until the end of the season. So just be mindful of that. If he can't go, Deontay Johnson can't go, rather. James Washington, Chase Claypool will be launched into the lineup. And if Adoree is back, Chase Claypool, that deep, deep, deep sleeper option for me personally. Eric Ebron, really good option this week. Just be mindful, it is Eric Ebron, so he could end up shitting the bed, if you will. But he has a good matchup this week, so you start him as well as the Pittsburgh defense. And then just to recap again, Henry, you're going to start. A.J. Brown, start him if he's available and healthy. Tannehill, you phase out. Corey Davis, I'm not starting. Jonnu Smith, I'm trying to get maybe a better option. I don't think he's going to produce for you. And Tennessee's defense, stay away from that this week. I don't like the matchup. I think Steelers come in here. You could tell that they're really stingy in a lot of areas, and they are not as stingy in an area where Titans are kind of weak. So I like the Steelers in this matchup. I like all those players that I mentioned. Again, that deep sleeper Chase Claypool. Make sure you double check if Dory's healthy and he's activated and playing, and if Deontay Johnson is out. Those are the 2 conditioning factors that need to happen for Chase Claypool to have that quote-unquote big game this week.